Alright guys, so in this second video, we're gonna kind of touch on a couple different scenarios here. In the file that you saw earlier, in the texture mapping render file, if you kind of start to pan to the right, you'll see three sets of things that we've set up. Okay, now these are actually kind of saved in there, and the textures are already pre-applied, and in these guys I've actually already kind of pulled out the gizmo or the sort of texture mapping gizmo, so you can kind of see what's happening. Okay, and this, as you kind of saw, you've seen the process in the last video, going from like default to a sort of box mapping, and we kind of take a look at this. So our XYZ size is set to 15 overall, and basically in these situations, what happens when you, let's say, just take the gizmo and rotate it 45 degrees, right? For a texture map that is actually short in one dimension and long in the other, like this, then you get a situation where like these where like edges might not match up and whatnot, right? And then in these you'll always have like one side that kind of goes through and aligns, where the other one basically kind of goes up against the wider side, right? So one thing to kind of think about when you're kind of controlling these directions is to say, and I'm holding down my shift key to just like rotate 90 degrees, is to think about, okay, which are the sides of my object that are going to be seen the most, and which sides do I care about the most, okay? Just so you can understand that. Now, you'll see this in the sense like both, okay, I'm taking the gizmo, rotating it 45 in plan. This one is I'm taking and rotating 45 in sort of the elevation or in the sort of vertical direction, right? And just so you see, like, okay, in these cases, actually, like this kind of transfers over, but it's really just on the sides where you see the rotation, okay? And then one thing to actually remember here is that certain Rhino commands will actually affect both the object and the gizmo together, whereas certain Rhino commands won't. And so a really good example here is actually if I just do a scaling operation. So if I grab this guy, like the scaling sort of grip, that's the end of here, and I say, let's say, just stretch it, right? So you'll see when I stretches, the gizmo actually stretches with it as well. And you'll see the Z dimension here change, right? And actually if I stretch it horizontally, right, then that dimension right there, the Y dimension or the X dimension sort of changes with it, okay? So stretching, and I'm doing this just to be able to kind of show you, stretching, the gizmo changes with it, for example, okay? However, a command, let's say I'm going to rotate, okay, rotate this box using this corner, and just picking a direction like that. You'll see the gizmo rotates with it, right? The gizmo kind of follows the geometry. Okay, I'm going to, and that's like true for moving things around, blah blah blah, right? Okay, so that kind of like makes sense, right? Okay, now if I do something like move face, so the move face command, and I select the top face, okay, enter, select this corner, and basically kind of position it so it moves upwards. Oops. Change this directional constraint to normal, which kind of forces it to basically move vertically. You'll see that the gizmo stays the same in this sort of situation, right? So the texture kind of remains uniform even as it stretches upwards, okay? So just kind of realize, like, okay, there's a little bit difference. Some different commands might, operate differently relative to like what you're kind of used to right here, okay? These two are kind of funny just to kind of show you, okay, like you can kind of do a spherical mapping here, but if you basically smush, right, the same way I did that earlier, so like if I basically I can actually operate on the gizmo itself, right? So if I basically pulled out or showed using this show mapping to pull out the gizmo, I can actually scale the gizmo itself, and it would actually kind of change as well. It would change the mapping situation and how it reflects on the object. Okay, so that's actually just to introduce the concept that, yeah, you can manipulate the geometry, but you can also manipulate the gizmo itself, and it actually responds to those same transformations that you are used to. Okay, now let's move on to the top three. These three in the middle. Okay, so I've kind of labeled these as well. Go back to shader mode. Just these are all identical. Okay, only difference. So these are separate objects. This guy is grouped together, and you'll see that when we get to it. So for the most part, let's compare these two first. Okay. Now what I'm going to do, these don't have texture mapping on them at the moment, is I'm going to go to the materials, right, and say let's actually just select all these guys and apply assign to objects, right click, assign to objects, and I'm going to apply my concrete texture to it. Okay. Now what's happening here, and you'll notice, is that, okay, because the way Rhino wants to apply texture to these things by default, right, these are individual objects, it kind of takes into account the overall object size. Okay, so you'll see this guy, it's turning the corner, and it applies it at a certain scale and even orientation. You see like this stuff doesn't match up. This what guy, wants to kind of do it that way. This guy, right, it kind of has to do, it's related to how these surfaces or these walls were built in the first place. So this kind of, the problem is like, okay, if this is the same building, and these are meant to be the same material, then you have stuff that's kind of all over the place. You have a really big one, a really small one, and one in the medium and going in a different direction. Not ideal, right? Okay. So this one is a case basically where I took all these objects and grouped them together by using Control G. So basically, if I took these guys and said Control G to group them as together, okay, and so now this is grouped, okay, and then now if I apply assign to objects, at first it's the same, okay, it's identical to what we had before, but then I take the whole group, go to properties, right? Go to my texture mapping sort of channel here, okay? And then let's apply box mapping all together. So bounding box, world, capped, yes. Okay. So the difference now you see, okay, well now these are aligning now, right? Because it's now using, if I pull out the show mapping right here, pull out the gizmo is basically kind of treating them as an overall. Whereas, if I ungroup this really quick, if I pulled out the gizmo here, these guys actually don't have one because there is no mapping applied to them, and these are all just, on a sort of per surface or per object basis. So Rhino's kind of making up its own assumptions here. Here we're actually deliberating saying like everything in here is mapped to this gizmo box, this mapping widget here, right? There's a lot of them overlapping. That's because like 1, 2, 3, 4, these sort of objects 1, 2, 3, 4 are all kind of in the same place, right? Okay. Now, so one of the interesting things is that, let's say you can actually at this point figure out, oh, which one is which, because right now I'm actually controlling, for example, in this one, right? This gizmo is the one that's controlling this guy horizontally, right? So I can actually then now control these individually and be able to do that, okay, which is great because now if I wanted to kind of like say, oh well, these guys are vertical walls, so it makes sense that these guys all kind of line up, but the one that's like horizontal here is actually that's associated with this gizmo I want to just to be able to individually control it, or even actually go in here and edit the sizes, okay? Then you can actually do that. And sometimes I was kind of doing this as a whole group, right? And let's hide these mappings first, all right? So it might actually be easier if you select it and just like ungroup it, okay? So type ungroup, and then just select this one and pull out the mapping again by itself, right? So you can actually like know exactly, okay, that's the one, and I'm going to, like, for example, snap it to the corner, right? And maybe these are a little bit too long, so instead of like 50 here, we can lock the ratio. Let's do like 25, right? So that makes it shorter, and then unlock it and say, let's say do 20 in that direction, right? So essentially you can kind of now start to like adjust the texture mapping in different directions on their own. All right, so I mean, this is actually basically what this is supposed to be. This just kind of shows you a rotated version of that, and being able to like pick out a certain object even within the groups, or just the concept that you should, when you have things that are all similar, you really should just like do them all together and then make like individual tweaks to things on their own. Or actually in this case, right, if I ungroup it, I would say things that are similar, these three guys, group these and do their box mapping together and do this one together, you know, and do things that are horizontal together, but basically kind of group similar objects and apply the mapping that way. All right, okay. I'm going to hide this, okay. Okay, so let's go up back to here to the top, and we'll look at a couple of things. Now for this, real quickly, I'm going to switch back to rendered mode just to kind of show you the difference between some of these things, right? This is a slab object, which is made by using this, the polyline tool, okay? So you can kind of like draw some, well, undo. Actually, I'm just going to drag this. Okay, so something like that, okay? This is the polyline that you can draw using, you know, that way. And then if you just type slab, okay, and then you kind of determine an offset distance. In this case, it's like set to 1, right? And then a height. So I'll snap it to that. And you'll get an object that is basically kind of like that. Now, this is a much more cleaned up version. Prior to Rhino 6, right? These are like Rhino 4 or 5 versions. You would get these sort of beveled corners in the surface, and it didn't join them, you know, automatically cleanly like they did here, right? And so one of the side effects of that is when you applied a material, and this is default texture map, basically, you know, if you only just apply the texture without a mapping, right? Without actually specifying a mapping, you would get these parts. Essentially, like each of these surfaces would kind of, the texture was kind of crushed towards the center because of its geometry, right? Because it's beveled, and in this case, because it's a parallelogram, the top, and so it would be kind of slanted, right? And you can kind of see that it would just like really look odd on the ends, okay? And so because of that, the way you would kind of solve that or work with that issue was to actually just like apply a overall box mapping to the slab object, just like this, right? Okay, and this is still the version that basically has these sort of tops. Okay, now you wouldn't have that issue in Rhino 6 versions and further or beyond, because like, so we can try this and go to material, apply the concrete material, right? And you see that, okay, now this actually comes in nicely. It doesn't have that weird thing. Basically, it's treating the sort of top surface as a one continuous surface. So one of the funny things that I've noticed with this newer sort of geometry is that if you look at the properties here of the object, it's a closed extrusion, which is a little bit different from a polysurface, right? Because it's a closed extrusion, the texture mapping actually, the changes you make to the texture mapping actually don't show up until you activate the gizmo. And you'll see that when the gizmo mapping widget is, sorry, I keep on saying gizmo, when the mapping widget is active, actually the changes you make do show up, and you can kind of change them. But when you hide the widget, they actually revert back to normal, or like what it was previously for. And so I think one of the things you would have to do would be actually to get this to work properly would actually have to be to like explode it, everything, and then join it back together again. So actually now it is a polysurface, okay? And then the mapping that we had earlier actually now gets applied to it overall. This is the 30, and then the widget actually is here, and when you change it, like it actually shows the changes like we want it to, and it doesn't disappear after you hide it. Okay, so that's just like sort of one weird quirk about the extrusions object type in this newer version, right? Okay, now we're kind of up to here just to kind of show you how you apply the box mapping. Now here's the thing, right? Like the box mapping, all that looks good up to here until you have a sort of diagonal. Now the problem with this diagonal is that at least, um, because it's being projected on a diagonal, that, okay, these block sizes probably don't actually really match, and then the top kind of does this weird thing, right? So if you look at the shaded version here, right, these are just sort of rebuilds to kind of take this sort of stuff away. And there are actually probably like, a lot of different ways you can do this. I'm actually just going to copy this guy out, right? One really quick and easy way is to do merge all faces like this, which then kind of cleans it up, okay? It will kind of tend to make that big sort of top surface one big thing, however, okay? And you can get something basically that's clean like this, has no mini breaks in it, okay? Now, going back to the render view, this is just a clean geometry, just like that, kind of rebuilt, and then with default texture mapping applied to it, just so you can kind of see what that looks like. It's a little bit different from here, okay, because it kind of looks at these surfaces individually, but now because this is one sort of overall object, it gets kind of applied overall more cleanly, right? Now, this is clean geometry with planar mappings. Basically, like everything is aligned looking down across it, projecting through it. But the sides obviously it's just like the edges, right? It's just the streaking, okay? Now, the one thing you might want to fix in this situation is really this diagonal portion. This is actually a portion that would benefit from actually being pulled out and then basically mapped to on its own, okay? So, the way we do that, I'm switching back to shaded mode to do this, and you can kind of do this. There are several different ways. I'm just going to show you one that's based off of extrusion. Okay, so if you have something like this, you can run a command called duplicate face border. So dup face border. Okay, and then I'll just click on the top here and enter or space bar. Okay, now once that's done, basically what you're getting is this outline. Okay, this is a closed polyline, and then I'll just draw this line by doing the polyline command, or this guy here, and just like making sure my snaps are on and just drawing that line. Okay, and then I will split using the split command. Select object to split, meaning this thing. Select cutting objects, meaning that line, and basically it chops it in two. Okay, now I'll select these guys, join them together, so they're now one. Okay, now I'm just going to move this out of the way so you can see this better. Then I'll draw this line back. Okay, or actually you can just take this guy and say close, which means it'll close it back, and then we can then move this back and snap it back into place. Okay, and then extrude, so EXTRUD, right? Extrude curve. And I'm going downwards just to make it kind of the same sort of height as well. And just note that like there are some extrusion options. Yours might be different. Just make sure that the solid here is set to yes. Otherwise, you would get something like this. This is kind of like an open corner, right, version. So like the tops and the bottoms aren't like capped. So you can just run the cap command just to close it if you wanted to, but that's just a little bit different. Okay, just make sure the solid option is ticked, and now you would get, you would get this and this as basically two separate parts. All right, and then to work with this, let's go to materials, right? Apply our concrete onto it first, and then second, switch to render mode so we can see it. And then this guy, as you can kind of see, it's already, at least these subdivisions are following that direction, even though like the scale is kind of different, right? Because still looking at it on a per face basis, the default mapping, that's what it does, right? You get some weird stuff there. But let's do a box mapping to it, right? So texture mapping, apply box mapping, and just accept the defaults 3 times, right? Okay. Let's equalize. Basically, the x equals y equals z is an equalize option, right? And lock them proportionally, and let's try, 10. Now, this, going back to here, it has the same problem that we had before, closed extrusion, right? So it's still an extrusion, okay? So same here, right? So just like kind of be careful with the extrusion types. So like, the texture mapping sometimes goes wonky with them, right? So same thing, explode it, join it back, okay? This guy, explode it, and then join it, right? Basically, we're converting these into polysurfaces, so texture mapping can be applied properly. And the box mapping is still there. Let's change this to like 30. So 30 overall, this guy as well. Okay. Lock it, change it to 30 overall. Okay. And you'll see now these two are not perfectly aligned. Okay. So we might have to, in this case, get the mapping out of the sky, or show mapping. Actually, I haven't applied the box to this yet, so we'll do that really quick. Accept defaults, okay, and then equalize, lock, change these to 30. So now you'll see these actually perfectly align. Now the question right now is that, okay, this is kind of at an angle, right? So let's get our mapping widget out. And I am actually going to use this and snap it to the corner. Okay. Let me see. The shaded mode might be easier for you to see. Okay. Snap it to the corner and then rotate. So R, rotate. And then click here, and then snap it to the corner. So basically, I'm rotating the widget so it's at the same angle as this guy and as the wall. Okay. Let's switch back to render mode. And so now you'll see the division actually follows the breaks right there. And you can look at stuff like that and whether or not you want to actually just like, slide this one direction or other to get a better joint or seam there. Now the top and the bottom of this, obviously because this is starting at, it's good to kind of look at this, right? That's 30. If I pull out and show the widget for that guy, you can see the reason they're misaligned is that they're at different levels, right? Okay, so we can actually just move it vertically, so move, and I'll select the vertical constraint. Oops, let me try that again. So select the mapping thing here. Okay, select it, move, select vertical, and like click here. Right, at one of the corners, doesn't really matter, and you'll see that it kind of constrains it to move vertically, right? And I'll select like the bottom corner of the wall. So that means like the mapping widgets are now like starting at the same sort of bottom level, right? And so that should actually perfectly align our seams. Okay, so that just gives you an idea, how to kind of fix these sort of small things. They are kind of small details in terms of the textures, but it's just like, when you have a scene that has textures that's trying to kind of get us to a more realistic feel of the space, then sometimes these little small details can throw you off and like really make your rendering look unrealistic if you don't kind of like adjust these things like this, right? It really kind of throws off the scale of things and makes it look really sloppy. Okay, all right, that's it. Really, just to kind of give you guys a concept of how to deal with those things. One thing to note is that if you know that you're going to be applying materials or material mappings to this, and you kind of want to avoid that extrusion problem, you can actually change a setting. So I guess the command is called use extrusions. Right, so this is basically sets it by default whether or not when possible. So like whether or not when you extrude, does it extrude like as an extrusion object like we had before, and then we had to fix it, or you can extrude it just as a polysurface to start with, right? So if I did sort of choose that, and I basically extruded this, this object type would actually come in as a polysurface by default. So that's just like a sort of setting toggle. They use the extrusion by default, extrusion object type by default, simply because it's more memory efficient, right? But if you don't have too much geometry in your scene, it's usually not an issue. Okay, so it's just something kind of a quirk to remember. All right, that's it.